which is Robbie Williams from Leeds, who'll be talking to us about how many, I think it was how many virtual skeletons, but you're just saying how many skeletons. I'll let you
Right.
introduce it.
Okay, yeah, I can't remember exactly what the original title was, but so thanks so much for the organisers for inviting me to give a talk here. I also want to thank my funders, the European Union, details of which are at the bottom of this first slide. So what I've got 5 slides, and the aim is to introduce one kind of case that I've been thinking about that can arise in virtual reality, augmented reality, also in other kinds of interactive games in particular, and just think through that through the lens of the kind of digital realism that Alexandra just was talking about. You've been reading David Chalmers' work, and also from the point of view of the virtual fictionalism that Nathan Wildman and Neil have been introducing as well. So one puzzle case and what these kind of 2 different perspectives would say about it. Also, so what's the puzzle case? Well, it's to do with the way that augmented reality, virtual reality can and characteristically does involve a certain kind of just-in-time world building. So when I'm thinking about this, the thing that comes saliently to mind, since with my nephew, I'm playing kind of Dungeons and Dragons again for the first time in 30 years, is the way that the rules that are set down in the story for Dungeons and Dragons for the Dungeon Master to follow can say, if the companions decide to open this door, they find 2 6-sided dice skeletons inside. So what happens is, you know, the players decide to open the door, and then Dungeon Master rolls 2 dice, and it turns out there's 2 and 3 land, and so they're then facing 5 skeletons inside this closet. Okay. So, like, you can imagine that implemented just in the code of a computer game, including AR, VR computer games, okay? And if you like, in the engagement with that that VR experience, it's not like you're supposed to think, 5 skeletons just vaporized from nowhere just now in this cupboard. You're supposed to think, like there were 5 skeletons in this cupboard, and they were revealed when I opened this door. So I'm saying that one truth about these virtual worlds in this kind of, that are generated in this kind of dynamic and random way, is that even before the time when you open the door, there were 5 skeletons inside the closet. And if you don't like that, well, before T in the virtual world, there were at least more than 2 skeletons in the world. That's the idea that, well, at least 2 skeletons in the closet. That's because the kind of laws of the world, the generating rules, fixed it that there'd be at least 2. Okay, that was kind of written into the code. There's no kind of play of the game where upon opening the door, you find less than 2. Okay, but look, so that's the truth about the virtual world, I'm thinking. And another thing you can think about is if we look down towards the kind of the digital underlay of this, well, the 5 digital objects that correspond to those skeletons first came into being at the time when the players opened the door. Okay, so think of these as lines in a database, or grounded in distinct lines in a database. Those kind of lines were generated by the code at the point when the players made that decision. Okay, so this kind of just-in-time, dynamic, random generation of virtual worldly facts is not just for game playing, though that's a particular salient instance of this. There are kind of workspaces or social spaces which will have analogs of this feature of them. I think in Dave's book, he talks about certain kind of social spaces which are large-scale environments. You might imagine these as a kind of park, and you walk around it with your friends in the kind of virtual space, and you know the distinctive layout of the parkland kind of springs into being. What trees there are over the horizon might be kind of randomly determined by the code. Okay. It's also a plausible feature. If you think about the rationale for generating these things in a just-in-time way, it's a plausible feature of, if you like, most simulations, given the resource constraints, extremely efficient to only create the kind of lines in the database when they're actually needed, when the players are going to encounter them, rather than kind of building a super detailed world and kind of statically coding in that stuff from the beginning. Okay. So that's the kind of case I want to think about, and I've given you two claims about the virtual world that I want to that I think are true in that scenario. All right. So let's think about this from the angle of digital realism, which I'm understanding, through the way that Dave Chalmers has outlined it and defended it. Not sure whether my understanding of it quite aligns with the way Alexandre was doing. I may be wrong about this, but let me kind of like set out the kind of core elements as I understand it. And then if I'm getting this wrong, then people can correct me. So I'm thinking that Chalmers thinks, like, first of all, as part of kind of the base ontology of a kind of physical world like ours, we have these things, digital objects. So you can think of those as grounded in more straightforwardly physical objects, which are things like lines in actual databases, which may be kind of themselves like patterns of voltages that are kind of stored in a particular place. They kind of, those voltage patterns are actually kind of inside this CPU that lies in front of me. But we were talking about the crossplay problem earlier. You might think, well, digital objects go further than that. The pattern of voltages here and the pattern of voltages in a machine in Neil's computer, maybe they both kind of constitute the same digital object. So we might be kind of a bit more loosey-goosey about what the digital objects are and how we cross-identify them than if we were just talking about lines in databases or even kind of patterns of voltages. Okay, so we've got these digital objects floating around, and then the core claims of digital realism will be that virtual objects, things like the skeletons, they're going to be identical to certain digital objects that play the right role. This role might be interacting in a skeleton-like way with other virtual objects, or kind of relating to me, not a digital object, but a participant in the virtual world in the right way, appearing skeleton-like. This is a bit like the Apple case from before. Okay, so we've got the virtual objects identical to digital objects. And virtual properties then are kind of identified by structural role of those properties. So like the kind of relative spatial locations of these 5 skeletons. Okay, that this skeleton is next to that one. What does that consist in? Well, there's a sort of abstract structural role that next to relations would play. And then we look for a realizer within the system that features these digital objects that we're identifying with the virtual objects. And we're picking out some digital property of those digital objects, which realizes the appropriate role. Okay. I mean, put into the kind of side comments here that the way I'm thinking about phrases like being virtually next to or being in the virtual closet is as a kind of a labeling convention that's really can be quite unsystematic. Okay, I'm thinking of it as something, as communicating something like the property of being virtual F, the thing that picks out is some property realized by these digital objects that plays something or other like the F role, the role that F plays for us. But the role only needs to be analogous. It needs to be the sort of counterpart within that domain of F for us. So that could be kind of loosey-goosey in all sorts of ways. This project of trying to kind of compositionally generate what the virtual property is out of the actual property in virtualness is not something that I was kind of thinking was part of the picture. I could be wrong. All right, so now we've got these kind of virtual objects, we've got the virtual properties. What about other kinds of truth? Okay, well, I'm thinking that if we've got a bunch of digital objects, we've got a domain of digital objects, all of which are relevant to this particular playthrough that we're doing of the VR or AR game. The domain of the virtual world are all the digital objects that play a specific virtual object role. Okay, that's probably only for VR and may need to be qualified to bring in the players, I'm now thinking. But there we go. And then I'm making an assumption here, which I'll call classical projection, is that we've got domains and we know what the names refer to and what the kind of predicates refer to, like virtual skeleton, within what their extension is within the domain of the virtual world. Then, you know, you hit it with your standard Tarskian story about how truth values of sentences depend on the extensions of the little bits of the sentences, and you'll get the standard story out. I just wanted to kind of flag that up because you could, when these kind of cases I'm about to talk about, they involve existential quantifiers and universal quantifiers and things like that. And if you had some funky story about these kind of work in very different ways from the kind of Tarskian standard story, then the sort of stuff, that would be one way of resisting what I'm about to say. All right. So what I'm claiming on behalf of the digital realist then is that before the time at which the players open that closet door, it's just going to be false that there are at least 2 virtual skeletons in the closet. And so a fortiori, it's going to be false that there are 5 skeletons in that closet. I mean, intuitively, where are the digital objects which are the skeletons, right? There was a line of code that said, in a kind of indeterministic way, you know, generate some lines in the database. But the line of code, well, it's kind of one thing there, not 5, right? And it's compatible with 2 or 6 or 12 lines in the database being generated. Okay, so it just doesn't look like within the domain of the virtual world, before the time when they open the closet, there's anything to identify with virtual skeleton. Okay, so I'll mention kind of one possible thing that you might say in a second, but you could, there's a question about like how bad this would be. So, you know, one picture of a digital realist world is it's kind of, when it's got this sort of just-in-time world generation in it, is it's kind of a locally expanding bubble around the players or the users if it's a social workspace. And so, you know, the real world is already laid out, and if we walk into it and walk into a pre-existing reality, then maybe the sober truth about virtual worlds for the digital realist is that there's nothing there until we walk out the door, and then kind of it randomly comes into being. Okay, that's a possible view. It feels to me like this way of going this way of kind of embracing the consequences of this will mean this kind of, that our engagement with virtual reality and augmented reality and these sort of things will have to involve accepting that it kind of is systematically illusory in a certain kind of way. I mean, you know, you're supposed to think when engaging with this game, you know, worry about how many skeletons might be behind this door, okay, in advance. You know, you're not supposed to go around saying, well, there's definitely no skeletons behind this door. You know, open it, then 5, and going, well, you know, what I thought was exactly right, but now they've just come into being. That's the wrong way of engaging with these kinds of games. In the same way, in the social space, you're not supposed to think we're in this kind of bubble of parkland, and if I go over there, you know, I'll get some more parkland, but nothing exists. This kind of seems like not the way you're supposed to engage with it. Okay, so that's fine. It could be that we're just kind of wrong, or the engagement should be this way that is actually kind of false to digital reality. But that's a kind of systematic illusions. If this is systematic over most simulations, it means that, you know, for the purposes of the kind of simulation arguments that Dave talks about, then most people in most simulations might be subject to these kind of systematic illusions. Okay, so before I move on from digital realism, I want to kind of mention one thing that I think the digital realist could say about this case, and just introduce a second variant of it that we'll carry through. So remember, the issue was that we opened the door, suppose that's 6 p.m. on Monday, open the closet door within the game, and then the digital objects were then generated, these 5 lines in the database or whatever. Beforehand, I said there were, you know, that makes it true that kind of beforehand, there were 5 skeletons in that closet. Well, we know that objects' spatial locations in the real world could be different from their spatial locations in the VR world. Their temporal locations could be different as well. So you might think that in this kind of case, one thing to say is there are indeed virtual objects within the domain of this virtual world. They're just currently in the future, right? But in the virtual world, as it were, they're kind of physically in physical space-time, they're in the future. But in the virtual world, those physically in the future objects are already in the cupboard of the kind of virtual world. And this is a little bit mind-bending to see how this could work, but if you're a kind of four-dimensionalist about these sort of things in the kind of physical space-time, well, maybe the kind of all these kind of facts could make sense together. I just wanted to kind of mention the other obvious version of this case, which is where we've got that none of the players ever opened the cabinet. Okay, and I'm wanting to say, if they just kind of take the rightmost corridor and not the leftmost corridor, which leads to the room with the closet, where the code says they open that door, there's skeletons. I want to say this virtual world contains at least 2 skeletons in the closet in virtue of the code having that particular rule in it, even though the people never open that closet door, and so there's never any lines in the database generated which we could identify with the digital objects. So this is a kind of, the untriggered case can't be dealt with by identifying the digital objects, these virtual objects with digital objects that exist in the future. They would have to be kind of maybe possible objects or something like that. So that's, I think, a kind of strengthening of the case if you're tempted by the funny business with temporal locations. All right. So suppose we either, for that or other reasons, we think, well, digital realism isn't looking so hot at the moment. Maybe we will want to see what other options we can think about and see what they say about this problem. So I'm now going to talk about digital fictionalism a la McDonnell and Wildman. So for them, I'm going to run through this very quickly, but for them, the virtual world is a Waltonian game of make-believe, okay, whose props are the base world, the physical world experiences generated by VR and AR devices. Okay, so what's a Waltonian game of make-believe? Well, Walton's idea was that there are certain kind of, part of the practice of various things from art to novels to kind of all sorts of different sort of fiction was that we have some artifacts in the world which come along with certain sort of norms about how we're supposed to engage with them. So if you're reading a novel, then one of the norms around here is that if you're to engage with it qua novel, you're prescribed to imagine, maybe in the first instance, that the sentences, the content of the sentences that are written on the page. It's a traditional novel with a reliable narrator. Okay, so that generates a sense of propositions that you're prescribed to imagine. Let's call those the kind of fictional truths, or what's fictional in the world of the novel. And then there are further norms, generative norms that go on top of that, or principles by which further prescriptions to imagines are generated. So we could take those primary fictional truths that we get by the first generative principle and say, well, look, you're also supposed to imagine anything that would have to be the case for those primary truths to be the case. So it's never stated in, a particular novel that the characters are breathing, but nevertheless, you should imagine them breathing and having kind of circulatory functions just like any ordinary person would have at that point. Okay, so the idea is here, the novel, the sentences in the novel are functioning as props. There are some kind of principles that tell you what to imagine when you're confronted by a prop, and those principles tell you what's fictionally true in the particular game of make-believe you're playing. So the idea is like, okay, VR, AR, we've got these headsets, we're having these kind of experiences in several modalities, okay? Those are real world happenings, just like the sentences in the novel are real world happenings. What are you supposed to believe at that point? Well, one thought is that you're supposed to imagine that these are experiences as of the things they appear to be. So if you've got a VR experience as of kind of a green block flying towards you, then you're supposed to imagine that a green block is flying towards you. Okay. So here's one observation about fictions, and especially serial fictions, which seem to be kind of like relevantly similar to some of these kind of cases. So, you know, Dickens writes his kind of novels, one chapter at a time, publishing them over several weeks or months. His later episode, the later installments of the serial fiction can backfill fictional truths that happened like earlier in the story, you know. So you can have kind of text that's written late on in a book and late on in the actual temporal process of your engagement with this prop, which makes, in the game as a whole, it true that, you know, thousands of years ago, there was a kind of an explosion which left these magnetic traces. There's no mystery, I think, in fiction why consuming it in a temporal order has to kind of like correspond to where the kind of temporal location of the things that are made fictional go in. You just learn more about what you're supposed to imagine as you kind of successively engage with the fiction. And so you might think, look, the user's experience after Monday at 6 p.m. when they open the closet, make fictional that there were always 5 skeletons in the closet, including the tea. Okay, maybe this comes because they're supposed to take their experiences at sort of face value. Their experiences are as of 5 skeletons. What would have to be the case for that to be true in this fiction is for the skeletons to have been there beforehand. That's kind of the counterfactual elaboration of the implicit content of the fiction. Okay. So that all seems like quite a nice handling of the original case that I gave, the one where they kind of opened the closet and generated 5 skeletons. We haven't got any kind of worry about fitting this into digital reality at this point. We're just kind of appealing to things that have precedent in fictions. The case of the unopened closet, where they never open the closet door, seems a bit more tricky, right? Because in that case, there is no experience on a particular playthrough of this game, which corresponds to, which makes fictional the fact there are 5 skeletons in the closet. Right? In fact, it's kind of completely indeterministic how many skeletons would have been in the closet had they opened them. So, although there's a kind of a very nice, well-motivated story, I think, of the kind of the original open the closet door case and how you get this kind of temporal backfill in the kind of fiction case, the unopened closet is a bit of a puzzle if you agree with me that it's true in the virtual world that there are at least 2 skeletons. Okay. So the same problem actually goes for statically coded elements. If you kind of have this story and on a particular playthrough, the kind of props in this game of make-believe are just the experiences that you and the other kind of users happen to have. Like if we never encounter a particular tree that's coded in that we would have done if we'd taken some other decision, kind of some choice puts in the game, like that tree doesn't look like it's kind of made fictional in this kind of game of make-believe that we're playing, that it exists. So all sorts of things that are kind of implicit in the code and that we would have experienced if we'd taken other paths are not made fictional in a particular playthrough. All right. So, you know, different sort of puzzles for these characters. Okay, let's think about this a little bit. So I want to try and kind of fix up some of the apparent puzzles that I see for kind of the kind of McDonald's, Wildman fictionalism about these things. So Watson has this kind of distinction between what's true in a game and what's true in a work that the game is based on. So, you know, think about a game on which think about a work of fiction in which the narrator directly addresses the reader. Now, it may be kind of the appropriate way to engage with that work is for you to imagine you being addressed by this kind of narrator. It's true in that game that I'm playing, engaging with this work, that I'm being addressed. If Chris was to engage with that, it would be true in the game of make-believe he was playing, that Chris was being addressed, and so on and so forth. What's true in the work, Walton says, is what's true in every authorized game. So as long as people are engaging with it properly in accordance to the prescriptions, the particular games they play may be different, but the work as a whole generates a different set of fictional truths, what's fictional in every authorized game. Now, I think kind of interactive fictions where everyone's kind of particular slice through the kind of the experience is different, may need to be kind of adjusted slightly from that characterization. So think about this kind of this alternative characterization of what's fictional in a work, which says that something's fictional in the work just in case it's fictional or as open in every authorized game. So this says something like this. Yeah, sometimes you just might not encounter the virtual tree or the virtual skeletons. But and then it will just be open in your game of make-believe what's going on with the trees or skeletons there. But insofar as anyone kind of takes a view on the trees or the skeletons in an authorized manner, they're supposed to imagine this. In that kind of situation, this kind of second work world definition is going to say those facts get to be fictional in the work. So the idea is we all kind of explore in different playthroughs different parts of the same virtual world, and we aggregate all those kind of what's common to all those kind of elements into the work world as a whole. So given the code, there'll be at least 2 skeletons in the closet, will be fictional or open in every authorized game. And so fictional in the work world. There are 5 skeletons in the closet and its negation will each be fictional in some games, right? Because there's a random generation, so in some ones it's kind of 12 and sometimes it's 2. So that's not going to be fictional in the work world. The work world will be open in this respect. Okay, and that seems like an intuitive result, right? We've got a kind of openness of the world exactly at that point. Now, if we wanted to kind of bring this back to the game world thing, you know, we could do it. Maybe I won't kind of go through that there, but you might think there could be a sort of meta generation principle, which if something's true in the work, then it gets inherited by the games. But, you know, let me kind of not get into kind of fine-grained details there. Okay. So that's one thing that I think gives us a kind of, to my mind, that gives us a kind of satisfying take on the original puzzle. So we get there's at least 2 skeletons in the closet being fictional. We get it being open, how many skeletons there are in the closet. If we're a digital fictionalist, this is fine. And I just want to point out that this is also something that if Chalmers embraces the more kind of bubbly, skeptical, I was saying illusory kind of construal of what's soberly going on in a virtual world, he could also borrow because he makes the perfectly valid point that you can play games with all sorts of objects. It could be that we're kind of playing a game of make-believe with these things. It's like the digital objects are kind of actors who are kind of pointing off stage. And so you're supposed to imagine there are things that are off stage, even though kind of like there are no actors which are kind of just off stage that they're speaking to. So I'm thinking about Henry V and kind of the vast crowds of soldiers that he's supposed to be speaking to. There are no, as it were, kind of entities to identify with those soldiers, but this kind of real person on stage. These kind of skeletons act a bit like that. Okay, so this would be a view in which the digital objects or the virtual truths themselves are the props, rather than kind of the experiences and so on acting as the props that Neil and Nathan were talking about. So kind of Chalmers can kind of buy into this stuff as well, I think. Okay, I wanted to finish in the last 5 minutes just by tying this down, relating it back to a few thoughts or questions that I had, thinking specifically about the VR and the AR case. I mean, lots of what I've said so far really goes for role-playing games and kind of computer games and other kind of interactive fictions just as well. But some special questions that I think arise for VR, AR. So here's a question for the digital realist. And this is really about how commonplace the kind of this sort of fictional stuff will go. So like we've met up in kind of big screen VR. I think I've got the name of that one right. It's really compelling, that one, to have, you know, social meetups in. One of the things that makes it super compelling is there's this kind of automated eye tracking thing. So if you talk to people there and their head is orientated in the right way and they're close to you, their eyes meet your eyes. And that gives you this, like, nowhere at a philosophy conference have people been so interested in the things that I was saying when I've been chatting to them over coffee. There was no kind of looking around to see if something was more interesting just with the eye movements there. So there's kind of this sense of real attention, rapt attention that you get from that kind of eye tracking gizmo. I think to engage in the social space, the way you're supposed to engage with it is just to go along with that pretense. I mean, it really facilitates a certain kind of social interaction. That's easy for the digital fictionalist to say, right? They can think, well, you know, this is kind of social VR. There's kind of, all of this stuff is going to be kind of fiction, the environment, the avatars, and so on. This is also kind of fictional, that people are paying attention to you when the fictional eyes are kind of orientated in the right way. Okay. And I wonder what the digital realist description of these mental states that are falsely, presumably attributed to users are. So if I'm talking to Chris, and he's really kind of listening in to the conversation Neil's having next door, but the eyes and the avatar are focused, locked on mine, I attribute to him attention, but he's not attending to me. Maybe, you know, maybe the avatar is attending in some kind of, you know, that's kind of mental property. Can the avatars actually attend? So like, that's one puzzle case there. What are they going to say about those sort of cases? And maybe they can say just what they said about the kind of more role-playing game skeletons thing, right? Okay, we kind of go into this thing that really are digital objects around, but it's kind of a fiction that you have to engage in these cases. There's kind of all sorts of smoothings, and we just go along with the kind of fiction. That would suggest that the fictional engagement is a deep part of these things. I wanted to mention, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, there's all this stuff in Walton about what he calls prop-orientated make-believe. The point of engaging with a game of make-believe need not be that you really want the experience of make-believing itself. Maybe you're more interested in something about the props that are used, and the make-believe facilitates that. That's Walton's account of metaphor, right? So Bari is on the heel of the Italian boot. There's this game of make-believe where Italy is a boot, and Bari, if that's the right one, is kind of at a particular location on it. But what you want to do there is kind of communicate something about the relative physical locations of Bari in Italy, which would then kind of make true that part of the game of make-believe. All right, anyway, question for the digital fictionalist now. Augmented reality and Waltonian fictionalism. What are the props for Walton there? Will it be experiences indifferently, whether those are physically generated or digitally generated experiences? Are those kind of props? And so like the idea is, if I'm engaging with the augmented reality fiction, any experience I have to be props in the game of make-believe. Seems kind of odd, because when I'm walking across Washington Square and looking at kind of what's happening in the background, it looks like I'm kind of believing that, you know, this person is juggling, and there's nothing distinctive about imagining that also to be the case, even though kind of the whole scene contains a kind of an augmented reality piano kind of in the foreground. So I'm kind of just wondering about the psychological description of that sort of case. And a question for me, given the kind of solution I was offering in the last slide, was this. I generated work worlds to deal with these kind of, there's at least 2 skeletons cases, by appealing to there being multiple authorized games where the whole point is like we can explore whatever part of this kind of virtual space we like, right? That's kind of the interactive element, and you need to put all those things together to kind of get the fictional truths about the work. But you can certainly imagine, and I think this is kind of salient for the augmented reality case, maybe also kind of matrix style virtual reality, things which are only ever intended to be one-play games. You're not supposed to reboot and start it again from the beginning as you do with a video game or a social space, right? You might imagine kind of augmented reality objects, which, you know, a local council is using to kind of give directions to people through their city or whatever. If it's single use rather than multiply replayed, right, it might be that kind of there's only ever one authorized playthrough, and that's whatever playthrough that we all collectively do, right? You could say, well, in other worlds, there'll be kind of other playthroughs, this kind of contingent which playthrough we chose, but these other worlds have different physical facts, and if those are inherited in fiction, that would be just a different work of fiction with different props. So for single playthrough AR, then it looks like we don't have all the resources that I was thinking we could appeal to solve the problem. And yeah, I wonder whether that's a limitation on what I've been proposing. Well, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Robbie. Yeah, lots to chew on there. I'm missing Nathan not being here for some of it, because he certainly knows the Walton stuff a bit better than I do, so I may have a question shortly. But if you can put questions in the chat for me, please. Our first one will be from Chris.
Sorry, this is a very low level question, Robbie. It's about props, fictionalists. I guess I'm not getting why the fictionalist can't say the code is also part of the prop, and maybe you did allow that, but it kind of went by fast for me. Especially if you're thinking with the analogy with the novels, like the sentences are part of the props. The code is kind of like the sentence of the story being told. So
yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, actually, in the canonical paper that I'm drawing on, at one point, the first time they mention the kind of props, they say all these experiences. Second time, it's like the list includes the code as one thing. So yeah, I was intending to speak about that. I don't think I mentioned anything about it. What this got me thinking is that I don't really understand the rules for what can count as a prop and not in this kind of Waltonian setting. I mean, the natural first pass way to think about this, that I was thinking about this, which made me think the code wasn't there, was that, look, the props are things that can directly trigger the imagination. So the text is there in the novel, and you read through it. And so when you encounter this, when you get into the right relation to this prop, then you have an imaginative experience. And you know, there's text in computer games and stuff like that, and the text can be like that. And then I was thinking, look, the code is kind of behind the scenes. What is it about? You know, I might not even know that this is a kind of computer game, and how could where does the norm come from that says when the code is like this, I should imagine this and such? But there are kind of games where you might think you can stipulate that in this game of make-believe we're playing, you know, this character is evil if the number of stars in the galaxy is even, and not evil if the number of stars in the galaxy is odd. And these kind of rules, I'm using the number of stars of the galaxy as kind of a prop to generate prescriptions, and I don't encounter those facts. So really, this is kind of a question for the fictionalists. I would like, and for Walton, I'd like to have the rules of what the props can be and how they get these prescriptions to imagine placed in them. But you're right, if you could say the right thing about this, you could solve the problem that way, I think.
I guess maybe even in simpler ideas, we don't have a purely prop-based theory of what makes truth in the fiction. So we just whether or not the code is a prop or not, it can still be a truth in fiction fixing thing.
Yeah. I mean, so you could think that. I mean, another thing that's kind of analogous to this is kind of authorial intent. I mean, whatever, you need a story about truth and fiction fixing things. There needs to be some sort of story about how, or general type of thing it is that does this. We don't want like ad hoc things, but specific to the case of computer games, which have no analog anywhere else that just solve this problem. So I'm thinking, like you mentioned authorial intent earlier, maybe these prescriptions come in virtue of the author intending certain kind of objects to be in a causal chain that leads to imaginings. And if that was kind of an authorial intent generation of these prescriptions, then maybe the code is exactly that kind of thing. But we we'd want a general story about that, and then we'd want to kind of see whether code really can fit that role. That's the kind of discussion I think that would lead to.
Great, thank you. That's awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, well, this is where my question would come in then. So I think, yeah, the prop story is very important here, and Nathan and I are particularly liberal about this, independently of quite what Walton might say about these cases. And we need the code to be part of the prop for the things we end up saying in the virtual theft case, where we say that the prop was denied access to. Right. Well, we're committed to that, but because you don't directly engage with the prop only ever by proxy via something else, that seems to give complications. But in discussing this, the cases that, so I thought about props on a stage for a theatre production, and I thought about incrementally making them more difficult or more complicated, and where the behind the scenes stuff that rendered certain affordances for them, so like the horn you might squeeze or something like that, would all become props. And it's not just what it looks like on any given moment, it's the fact that it can make the noise that it can make, and how it makes the noise it might make, that all build into that. And that's where I see the analog for the analog for the code, if that isn't a mixed metaphor. So I think that's I think we say it's it can be props all the way down, but the other part of it is, I think at one point you said is we've got no relevant props, so there are no fictional skeletons. But that suggests that we need props for a game of make-believe, and again we're liberal about that, in the sense that we say, well, no, you don't actually need a prop. There can be non-propped fictions here. So it could be part of this story, just because we understand the affordances of the game that we're playing, that we'll endorse the fictions between 2 and 12 skeletons being in there, and remain silent about the others, a la incomplete fictions. But we don't need a prop to be there for us to say, well, we will suppose that there were between 2 and 12. Do you see what I mean? We don't need props necessarily for that.
Sure. I mean, so I think what you need is an account of fictional truth. And there's kind of like, one story is there's props with these kind of conditional generation of fictional truths, and there are these kind of meta principles. Maybe there are other things. Maybe, I mean, there's kind of like the stuff that, you know, in a certain kind of Renaissance art or whatever, these genre conventions. It's like, if you're dealing with a certain artwork and there's a guy with arrows sticking into him, then it's kind of St. Stephen or whoever it was supposed to be. And that's just like, that gets into a kind of, there's just like these things that, because of the kind of artwork it is, or kind of representational work, can just kind of slide in there. I suppose I wonder, even so, how the kind of code itself gets that. I mean, you say kind of, I'm just sort of thinking that, like, one thing is that the users of this stuff never see the code, need not even be aware there's code there. And that feels that seems very different from all these other kind of paradigm cases. I mean, it sounds like you've got a paper I should read where you kind of try to kind of do a sororities on this kind of stuff. And, you know, yeah.
No, that stuff isn't written. That was the background arguments between authors that gave rise,
to
some of the outputs.
Yeah. I totally agree that it's not all about props, but I mean, you know.
And I think in your D&D case, we've got the convention that we're dealing with a 6-sided dice that's got to roll if that door opens. So I mean, you know, we've got some of the scaffolding around it. Sorry, I'm eating too much time here. I better move on. But thanks for that, Robbie. Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie. This case is extremely cool. And yeah, I think these just-in-time generation raises all kinds of great metaphysical issues, and this case really crystallizes it. As I was saying over email when we talked about this, it reminds me a little bit of, you know, quantum mechanics case, you know, Schrodinger's cat. It's not determinate that whether the cat is dead or alive until you open the box. And I guess I'm inclined to give it a somewhat analogous treatment. Let's say we go with some orthodox collapsed version of quantum mechanics. Before you open the box, was the cat alive or dead? Well, you know, the real truth is it's neither. It's in a weird, before you open the box, the cat was in a weird wave function state, which can later lead to the cat being alive or being dead. And there's various ways in trying to turn this into ordinary language. But what's really fundamentally what's really going on is, you know, the cat's in this proto state, a wave function state. So I guess I'm inclined to say something analogous about your case. strictly speaking, before opening the box, it's not really the case that there's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or any particular number of skeletons in the closet. Rather, it's in this proto state, which by the principles of this digital system will later lead to it being the case that there's a fixed number of skeletons in the closet. I guess there's a semantic question about whether you describe that as it being indeterminate. There's there's some number greater than 1, but it's indeterminate which, or no skeletons in the closet. I guess I'm kind of inclined to say that both in this case and the quantum mechanical case, it's more correct to say, well, there's not exactly any skeletons in the closet, but later on there will be. It will be natural for users to believe, to act as if there's already, there's been a fixed number all along. If I go in there, how many are there going to be? It might be natural for them to adopt that attitude, but I think that would be more, kind of a convenience that's easily explainable away than the truth. One relevant case that's maybe a bit related is a case where maybe it is determinate how many skeletons will be in the room, but they haven't yet been generated. Maybe somewhere in the code for the system is the number 5. But so we've got as far as determining a number 5. No dice has to be rolled. It's somewhere there. Maybe there's a bunch of pseudo-random code or whatever. Anyway, 5 is there, so it makes it kind of determinate that there will be 5 skeletons there, but there's not 5 data structures.
Yeah.
There's it's just that later on all this stuff will be generated. In that case, I think I do want to say there are 5 skeletons in the closet. But in that case, it won't be in virtue of there being 5 data structures exactly. It'll be in virtue of there being this holistic data structure, which includes the number 5. And it's a little bit like maybe, there are 5 holes in the apple. Gets to be true in virtue of some big state of the apple. Maybe you could try and generalize that to a case where there are 5 skeletons in the closet in some sense, in virtue of the number 5 appearing at some future point in the system. I suspect that we could pretty easily define up and invent bits of natural language that work that way. And I think I'm kind of a con up here on principles of tolerance about how to speak. There might be some very natural bits of language that work that way, but what's fundamentally going on, I think one can maybe there's a natural treatment of where it just involves this proto state.
Yeah, interesting. So like I'll work backwards. So just 2 thoughts. So one thought on the thing where, interesting case where you kind of 5 has been rolled, but as the lines in the database haven't yet been generated. So the digital objects that will be the 5 skeletons have not come into being, and now maybe power is cut out, so they never come into being. So to get the truth of there are 5 skeletons in that case, which is I think what you wanted, we do need to deny that classical projection stuff. So funny business with how kind of sentences truth values relate to things in the extension of digital objects and the extension of skeleton. Definitely one thing we can do, and we just need to kind of look through the details to give a proper story about that. You could imagine, I don't know, I was thinking about these sort of potentialist stuff that Western Limbo has been talking about, where you kind of read existential quantifiers as kind of potentially yada yada, potentially there exists. And I wasn't quite seeing how to do it, but deny that classical projection principle and you can kind of play those games. And I can see the attractions of going that way. The quantum mechanical analogy is interesting. I mean, I was thinking if you went for something like this, where it's kind of this quasi state that's kind of there, this kind of uncollapsed wave function analog. One of the costs for you and your project would be that you'd get an illusion there, that kind of all the people, at least if they didn't know that they were kind of playing these sort of things, will be kind of believing that there are 5 skeletons in the closet. Well, there were 5 skeletons all along, and that'll be kind of a false belief, and that'll happen all the time if we've got these just-in-time generation, and that would be a somewhat of a cost. if you want this to be a non-illusory situation. I guess you could say that if quantum mechanics is about the real world, then we're kind of actually in that situation all the time with these sort of things. So yeah, but those are two thoughts.
Thanks.
Good stuff. And time for one last, hopefully quick question from Alex.
Hi, Robbie. Yeah, thanks very much for that. So I wanted to ask about your last question for the digital fictionalist about augmented reality.
Oh, yeah.
And so you're asking kind of, so what would the props be in that case? And I'm wondering, I mean, why do we need the props in that case, at least for the veridical parts of perception? Sure, we need them for the augmented bits, but do we need them for the bits that we see properly? And I wonder whether you can kind of make an analogy between reading a historical fiction, say like some bits you imagine, but other bits you just believe, right? And you don't need to talk about props for them. You just believe what you're reading. For the kind of made up bits, there you have props that prescribe you to imagine stuff, and you have all this fictional stuff. So I don't know whether the analogy is perfect, but could this be a kind of model to model AR?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I wonder if I was just thinking of prop talk really instrumentally. So I was thinking anything on which a prescription to imagine was conditional. So if the historical novel thing is like works as you say, then you might think, well, if Napoleon was kind of born in yada yada year, then imagine that Napoleon was born in that year. And there would be this kind of default inheritance principle from these facts about the actual world, which can be overridden when the fiction fictionalizes it. And, you know, in one sense, in a very thin instrumental sense, facts about the real world are acting as props because they're generating these prescriptions to imagine are conditional on them. So if we understand it thinly, then like in augmented reality, you might think, oh, lots of things are, insofar as the game we're playing kind of has all that kind of stuff in it. But in both cases, you see, in kind of engaging with a historical novel, you're kind of like closed off from your ordinary interactions with the world. I'm kind of there engaging in the game of make-believe. And I think what I was worried about here was the sort of cases where we're just walking through the stair in everyday life, and we kind of see the piano over there, and along with a lot of other stuff. And it sort of looks like we have to be both believing stuff about the real world and simultaneously imagining lots of stuff, including imagining all the things we're believing, or at least most of them. We won't be imagining there's no piano here, even if that's kind of strictly true. We'll be imagining that there's kind of a piano there. So it was that kind of doublethink worry I was thinking. I was thinking like psychologically, are we really kind of imagining all those kinds of stuff as well as believing them?
Yeah, curious case. I want us to, Nathan and I, to move on to thinking about AR stuff a bit more than that, but we've got a couple of other things to go first. So listen, that's been really interesting. Thank you again to Robbie. Thanks very much. That was
thanks for your questions.
Just to very quickly wrap up